Today I am building these two-way floor standing loudspeakers with Arylic AMT tweeter and 6.5-inch glass fiber cone woofer. So for the first design, using the Arylic 6.5-inch woofer, I decided to go with what we call a tapered quarter wave tube design, enclosure design. Now this was first mentioned or developed by a guy called Paul Voigt back in the 1930s. And he coined the tapered quarter wave tube, or it's also known as Voigt tubes. What we have here is essentially, it's almost like a transmission line speaker where we have a tapered pipe with the driver mounted about a third way into that pipe. The only difference here is that we also have a bass reflex port and a horn loading of the actual speaker. So it's not essentially, it's not outright a transmission line. It's sort of like more combination of a transmission line or a Helmholtz resonator, bass reflex port and a horn. So now there are calculators online that we can use to actually model an enclosure like this. I went to the mh-audio.nl website and I found that the online calculators on that site is actually quite good. So I would recommend you to go there if you want to have a look and read more about this and go try this for yourself. The calculator can give you quite accurate results actually. What it does recommend is that we have a driver that has a QTS of roughly between 0.4 and 0.5, which will give you the best results using this calculator. But there are also other factors that we have to keep in mind. So, you know, a tube like this will actually influence you know, a lot of your mid-range frequency, so we need to actually dampen the cabinet in certain critical places in order to make sure that we get the right frequency. So this is what I'm doing here right now. I've set this up in my measuring room and I'm playing around with the dampening, trying to find the best place to see where I can find the smoothest response for this woofer in this enclosure. This is a fairly large loudspeaker enclosure. It's about 39 liters internal volume. But together with the tapered quarter wave tube, it provides us with quite a few benefits. One of those is that we can get quite low bass performance from this little driver. Our F3 or -3 dB point in the low end is about 32 Hertz, which is quite impressive. So it would be interesting to see whether we actually get good bass performance from this loudspeaker. Another benefit is that we can use drivers that have a fairly low X-max or a cone excursion. That's how much that cone can move in and out effectively. I think in this driver's case it's about 5 millimeters. So as usual, I use SketchUp just to draw up the enclosure and to determine the internal volume and the driver positions. So I've done that here as well. So this enclosure, like I've said, is the tapered quarter wave tube. So we've got that divider in the middle, that slope divider in the middle, which then also helps to strengthen the cabinet and hopefully prevent some of the cabinet resonances that we'll get on the side panels. In terms of height, it's just over 1 meter high, so it's a fairly high loudspeaker. That's why I also position the tweeter underneath the woofer so that we can get that closer to ear level when you're sitting down. I designed a test port in Onshape that I just then 3D printed. I will also specify a port that you can buy off the shelf that will work with this loudspeaker. But this port is working quite well, so if you do have a 3D printer you can actually print your own port. These are my raw measurements of the individual drivers. So in the purple we have the tweeter, and the sort of like yellowy brown color is the woofer. Everything's looking in order here. We do have a bit of a rise on the tweeter from around about 6 kilohertz. However, we can take care of this with a wide sort of like parallel notch filter. The baffle is constructed of 2 pieces of 12mm or 1/2 inch MDF glued together. This gives the woofer a strong foundation to mount to and counters any resonances. I'm applying wood glue to one of the pieces, lining both up and then using brad nails to secure it together. However, I also add some clamps to further apply pressure and ensure a good bond between the two pieces. The next step is to glue the baffle to one side panel. The corners are kept in place with brad nails and the rest of the panel is clamped down until the glue dries. The bottom and top panels are also glued in place to make sure that we get a square glue up. The back panel is glued in place next, and again just using brad nails to secure it. As you can see, I'm using my new cordless brad nailer from Inco after constantly having issues with my previous few pneumatic brad nailers. It works great, and even though it is not cheap, it was definitely worth the investment since it's one of my most used tools in the workshop. Since this is a tapered quarter wave tube design or a void pipe, we have the angled panel on the inside that creates the folded pipe. I mark where this goes and then glue it in place. It is important here to make sure the positioning of this panel is accurate to get the most accurate results from the design. Before we close up the enclosure with the other side panel, I line the pipe with 12mm or 1/2 inch felt sheets in key areas. This is after doing some experimentation to get the best frequency response from the woofer. Later I will also add some polyfill or Dacron to certain areas inside the cabinet. I used a lot of clamps during this project, and the saying that you can never have too many clamps is definitely very true. I'm using a circle cutting jig and a cordless router with a downcut spiral bit to cut the holes for the drivers. The downcut spiral bit gives a very good edge without any chip outs. In hindsight, I should have cut the driver holes before I assembled the enclosure, just to minimize the dust that can enter into the enclosure. I will make this change in the build plans and order the assembly in this way. I managed this, however, by not cutting all the way through and then knocking out the piece. The inside edges can be cleaned up with a file and sandpaper. Another reason to cut the driver holes before assembly is that you can bevel the inside edge of the woofer opening, which I could not do. This will ensure that we do not get any unnecessary reflections back onto the driver cone. On the back of the enclosure, I am cutting the hole for the port. I'm using a 3D printed port and will supply STL files for this with the build plans. However, I will also specify a port that you can purchase off the shelf if you are not able to print your own. All the edges of the enclosure is rounded over with a 3/4 inch round over router bit. I like the way this looks and it does help with edge diffraction, but you can also leave the edges and corners sharp if you prefer. The effect on the frequency response will be minimal. The reason for this is that for a round over to be effective at countering edge diffraction, the radius has to be much larger to make a real difference between a 3/4 inch round over and sharp corners. I still recommend a slight round over, maybe just with a small 1/4 inch bit. This makes finishing and painting a bit easier compared to a sharp edge. You can see that I'm cutting through the brad nails and the router does this quite easily. These are then knocked back slightly into the MDF with a small nail punch and the holes filled with wood filler. This hole is for the terminal cup, and as you can see, my hole saw is a bit blunt. I will finish the enclosure with a semi-sheen non-drip enamel paint and apply it with a foam or foam with flock covering roller. Before the final coat however, I first coat the MDF with 2 coats of sanding sealer, sanding in between with 240 grit sandpaper. The coats of enamel paint can then be applied with the roller. I applied 4 coats in total. No sanding in between is necessary. Not being a big fan of spiked speaker feet, or sometimes also known as tiptoes, I use a good quality adjustable foot for each corner of the loudspeaker. These do not scratch my floor and I can still make adjustments to level the enclosure. I drill straight into the MDF here and using the bolt of the foot to cut the thread into the wood as I turn it in with a spanner. This creates a tight fit that does not leak air and it's quite durable over time as long as you do not adjust it too many times. The crossover consists of 12 parts, and if you want a more detailed explanation of this, then go check out my review video of the Arylic drivers, where I go into more detail on a similar crossover and what the parts do and how they influence the frequency response. Check the card top right or the link in the description below. While going through the rest of the graphs, I will start to assemble the crossover in the bottom left corner of the screen. The overall frequency response is very flat within plus minus 1 dB almost across the entire usable bandwidth. However, it does rise after 10 kHz, but this does not do the sound any harm, and if you can hear that high, then it will only add to a bit more detail in that higher frequencies. It is not obvious or fatiguing in any way. The reverse null plot shows good integration between the two drivers at the crossover point and centers around 3100 Hz. The in-room response is also very flat and gives a typical downward slope, which is normal and what you want. Horizontal dispersion is really good and goes up to 60 degrees from on-axis up to 8 or 9 kHz, after which it narrows to 30 degrees from on-axis. This is a good thing since we can compensate for the rising high frequency response above 10 kHz. My recommendation thus is that the speaker can be placed facing directly forward. No toe-in is required, and at least this is what worked best for me in my listening room. Impedance is a nominal 4 ohm and well behaved, only dropping below that briefly at 6 kHz. The crossover board is split into two parts. This allows easier placement inside the enclosure and access through the port opening. The board is 6mm MDF with holes drilled through and the parts secured with cable ties. Wiring of the components is point to point, and detailed instructions for the crossover assembly is in the build plans. Two wires are pulled through the enclosure and soldered to the tweeter and the woofer terminals. Important to note is that the tweeter is wired in reverse polarity. Some more damping material is inserted through the woofer opening behind the driver before the drivers can be fixed in place with screws. Both drivers have gaskets already applied to the back, so no need to apply your own. This is always a nice touch, and I wish all manufacturers will do this. Here you can see the two crossover boards that must be connected together before we secure them to the inside of the enclosure. I connect the ground ends and the positive power ends. The speaker wires are then connected to the woofer and tweeter points. A few holes are drilled into the boards for screws to secure the boards. If you align the boards just right inside the enclosure under the openings for the terminal cup and the port, you can screw it down with a long screwdriver. This shows the inside of the enclosure once the boards have been screwed down. The wires to connect to the terminal cup is pulled through and soldered in place before screwing the terminal cup down. Almost done, and the port must be glued in place. This is a 3D printed port that I gave a few coats of black spray paint. It's just glued in with CA glue. And the last step, gluing my resin dome logo to the front baffle of the enclosure to finish it all off. Listening to these speakers really surprised me. It sounds big and dynamic. The bass goes really low and from my perspective will not require a subwoofer at all. In response will easily go down into the mid-20s. Listening for longer periods of time does not become fatiguing with vocals and highs that are clear and does not get out of shape at higher volumes. The overall tone is neutral to warm in its presentation. These speakers, despite their size, has the ability to disappear very well in the soundstage and with certain music will extend beyond their physical position towards the sides. The soundstage is not the deepest I've ever heard, but rather big and wide. Imaging is spot on and you can place instruments in their place with the right music. I really like these. They have been fun to listen to and have been in my setup for some time now. This is a fairly easy build and I can highly recommend them as a project for anyone looking for a two-way floor stainer that has some punch and dynamics. Obviously the 6.5 inch woofer has its limits, so do not expect to drive them with bass heavy music to stupid sound pressure levels. However, with sensitivity of around 87 decibels, these do not need too much power from your amplifier to go more than loud enough for the average sized room. To build these for yourself, go to my website at soundblab.net and get the comprehensive step-by-step build plans. Links are in the card top right and the description below. To support my channel further, please consider to become a patron or join via YouTube memberships. This helps greatly towards bringing you these projects to enjoy and try for yourself. And a big thank you to my current YouTube members and patrons. You make a big difference. Subscribe, like and comment, and until next time, adios. But before you go, stay tuned for the sound demo. Best listen through headphones or earphones.
First of all, I got no regrets, but a twist and a turning, got no success. I remember the first time that we two met, the love and the chugging. Can't forget how you held me at my words. See right through, know what I deserve. The same old story, reminding me, is it my way or your way? Makes my heart beat to the rhythm of believing. I know you better than you know me better than me. I know when looking at this that we can keep a secret. Something about you isn't right. I swear you can make me lose my mind. Lying here awake at night. If this is love, then I don't want it.
Why you gotta be so complicated? I'm sick and tired of contemplating. I don't wanna be here waiting. If this is love, then I don't want it. I can't be the one you keep running to whenever you feel down. I can't be that someone who'll always be there when something's wrong.
Y el tiempo que no tenía por el roles que soñas, sino de noche, de día, si no pregunta tu almohada, por los gritos que escuchaban los vecinos. No te trago pero qué rico se vino, agua dulce, baby, puro manantial. Nos comemos y se volvió personal.
The gentle April rain that stained the window panes last night is all but gone, but lingers on in scented clouds of air. We watch the town awaken to the trembling morning light. You're so near